The Hidden Truth. Uncovering the Dark Secrets of Havenbrook. A supernatural thriller story. In the shadowed corners of Havenbrook, Eva and Tom stumble upon a chilling secret hidden deep within the forest. A stone circle protected by ancient, sinister entities. As they unravel the dark history behind the Watchers and the ritual circle, they must confront an otherworldly evil that threatens to break free. Join them on a suspenseful journey through the eerie depths of the supernatural. The rain had started again, tapping lightly against the window of Eva Mitchell's small apartment. She stared at the news clippings scattered across her dining table, all of them revolving around one person, Jacob Dwyer, the town's former mayor who had vanished without a trace exactly 5 years ago. No one knew what had happened to him, but Eva had her suspicions. Havenbrook had a way of swallowing people whole. The official story was that Jacob had left town one night after a bitter fight with his wife, Sarah. But Eva knew there was more to it than that. Jacob wasn't the type to just leave without a word, without a plan. She had uncovered discrepancies in the investigation. Phone calls that were never traced, records that had mysteriously gone missing from the town hall, and the odd behavior of the townspeople whenever his name was mentioned. A single line of text stood out from one of the articles in front of her. Last seen near the Whispering Woods. Eva had spent the past week combing through old reports, talking to locals, and piecing together the fragments of Jacob's last known whereabouts. The Whispering Woods, a dense forest that bordered the town, had always been at the center of strange occurrences, disappearances, unexplained noises, and sightings of figures in the shadows. As the town's only investigative journalist, Eva felt it was her duty to uncover the truth. And tonight, despite the chilling rain and the growing sense of unease, she was determined to take her investigation to the place where it had all begun. She grabbed her flashlight and a notepad from the table, slipping on her raincoat as she headed for the door. The air was thick with tension as she made her way through the deserted streets of Havenbrook. The wind howled, whipping her hair around her face as she approached the entrance to the Whispering Woods. The trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if to pull her into the darkness. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on her. But she had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she stepped into the woods, her flashlight slicing through the shadows. The path was barely visible under the thick canopy of leaves, and the rain muffled the sounds of the forest. But Eva couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been, making her pulse quicken. As she ventured deeper into the forest, she began to hear it, the faintest whisper carried by the wind. It was barely audible at first, but as she pressed on, it grew louder, more distinct. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Eva! Her breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, shining her light into the trees, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, closer this time. Eva, you can't hide. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let her imagination get the better of her. This was what she had come for, the truth behind the mysteries that haunted Havenbrook. And if that truth lay hidden in these woods, then she would find it. The whispers continued to swirl around her as she pressed on, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. Suddenly, the beam of light caught something up ahead, a small, weathered cabin half hidden by the overgrowth. Eva's heart pounded in her chest. The cabin wasn't on any of the town maps she had seen, and no one had ever mentioned its existence. It felt like it had been forgotten, swallowed by the forest. Taking a deep breath, she approached the cabin, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. The air seemed to grow colder as she stepped inside, the darkness closing in around her. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved cautiously through the room. And then she saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the wood with deep, jagged marks, were 2 words. Help me. Eva's blood ran cold. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The hidden truth was waiting for her, and it wasn't going to let her leave easily. Eva stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The door was shut tight behind her, the sound of the slam still echoing in her ears. She pointed her flashlight toward the scratched words on the wall. "Help me." The letters seemed to pulse in the dim light, as if the cabin itself was alive with a desperate plea. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. The air inside was musty, the scent of decay lingering in the corners. Every creak of the wooden floor made her nerves jangle, and the oppressive silence was pierced only by the ever-present whispers that danced in her ears. She had to stay focused. Eva moved cautiously toward the wall, her fingers tracing the rough letters. The scratches were deep, as though whoever had carved them had done so in a frenzy. But who had written them? And why? Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe this cabin had belonged to Jacob Dwyer. Maybe he had hidden here after his disappearance, leaving behind this cryptic message. But that didn't explain the voices, the chilling whispers that seemed to call her name, weaving in and out of her consciousness. She stepped back, surveying the rest of the cabin. It was small and sparsely furnished. A single wooden chair, a crumbling table, and what appeared to be an old fireplace in the corner. The walls were bare, save for the ominous writing. Dust covered every surface, undisturbed by time or the elements. As she turned toward the door, a sharp gust of wind blew through the cracks in the walls, extinguishing her flashlight. Eva cursed under her breath, fumbling to turn it back on. But the light wouldn't return. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. And then she heard it again. A low, rumbling sound coming from deep within the cabin. "Eva?" She spun around, her heart racing. The voice was louder now, more insistent. It was no longer a distant whisper carried by the wind. It was here with her in the room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound brave. But there was no response, only silence, thick and heavy. She felt a chill run down her spine. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching toward her like dark tendrils. She backed away, her hand frantically searching for the door behind her. But before she could reach it, something cold and wet brushed against her arm. Eva gasped and jerked away, her pulse spiking. She stumbled backward, colliding with the rickety table. The sound of wood scraping against wood reverberated through the cabin as she steadied herself. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the touch, but there was nothing there. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost deafening. They swirled around her, a chaotic chorus of voices she couldn't understand. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it only grew more intense. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. Eva cautiously removed her hands from her ears, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The cabin was still, the only sound the faint patter of rain on the roof. She took a step toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness, when she noticed something strange. The floor beneath her feet had shifted. What had once been solid would now felt softer, almost pliable. She crouched down, running her hands over the surface. The floorboards were loose, and one of them was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her. Eva pried the loose board up, revealing a narrow space beneath the floor. She shone her flashlight inside, and her stomach clenched at what she saw. There, nestled in the dirt, was a small, weathered notebook. Eva reached for it with trembling hands, pulling it out carefully. The cover was worn and stained, but she could make out the faded words scrawled across the front. "Property of Jacob Dwyer." Her heart skipped a beat. This was it, the clue she had been searching for. She flipped open the notebook, the pages yellowed with age, and began to read. The writing was erratic, almost frantic, as though Jacob had been in a state of panic when he had written it. The first few pages were filled with disjointed thoughts and cryptic notes. Mentions of people he didn't trust, of things he had seen but couldn't explain. But as Eva turned the pages, one entry caught her eye, sending a chill through her bones. "They're watching me. The shadows move when I'm not looking." I can hear them whispering, telling me things I don't want to know. I can't escape. I'm trapped in this place. The woods won't let me leave." Her hands shook as she read the words, a growing sense of dread settling in her stomach. Jacob had known something was wrong. He had felt it too, the same presence that now seemed to cling to her, watching her every move. Eva flipped to the last page of the notebook. The writing here was even more frantic, the letters barely legible. But she could make out one final message scrawled across the bottom in bold letters. "It knows. The truth is buried here. Find it before it finds you." Eva's blood ran cold. The notebook slipped from her hands as she scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here. Whatever had happened to Jacob, whatever truth he had uncovered, she wasn't going to stick around to find out. She rushed toward the door, but as her hand touched the handle, a deafening crash echoed through the cabin. The floor shook violently, sending her stumbling backward. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. "Eva, you can't run, you can't hide." She spun around, desperate to find the source of the voices, but the shadows had swallowed the cabin whole. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, and the air had grown so cold that her breath came out in white puffs. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The whispers faded to a dull hum, and the cabin fell into an eerie silence once more. Eva stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: Jacob's warning had been real. The truth was buried here, somewhere in the woods, and whatever it wasn't going to let her leave until she found it. Eva burst through the cabin door, stumbling into the rain-soaked woods. The air outside felt lighter, as though she had escaped from a suffocating grip, but the unease gnawing at her remained. Her eyes darted around, scanning the trees for movement, half expecting the shadows to take form and chase after her. She had never believed in the superstitions of Havenbrook, at least not until tonight. Whatever was in these woods wasn't just a story whispered around campfires, it was real, and it was watching her. Clutching Jacob Dwyer's notebook tightly in her hands, she moved quickly along the muddy trail, desperate to distance herself from the cabin and the sinister presence within it. Her mind raced with questions. What had Jacob discovered that drove him to the brink of madness? And what did he mean by, "The truth is buried here"? Eva wiped rain from her face as she pressed on, the trees closing in around her. She had to get back to town, back to safety, but the path was becoming more difficult to navigate. The woods were dense and unfamiliar, the trail slick with mud, and it was easy to lose direction under the thick canopy of trees. Her flashlight flickered weakly, the batteries threatening to die at any moment. And then she heard it, a soft rustling sound not far behind her. Eva froze in place, holding her breath. The wind was still and the rain had lightened to a drizzle, but the sound persisted. Someone, or something, was moving through the trees following her. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beams swept across the trunks of ancient oaks, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Nothing moved in the immediate area, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. She couldn't shake the sensation that unseen eyes were tracking her every step, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Her pulse quickened as she began to walk faster, her footsteps splashing in the puddles of water that had gathered along the path. But the rustling grew louder, closer, as though the forest itself was coming alive around her. Twigs snapped underfoot, and leaves rustled in the windless night. Eva's breath hitched in her throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. At first it was just a silhouette, a tall, shadowy form standing among the trees. She aimed her flashlight toward it, but before the light could fully illuminate the figure, it vanished, slipping deeper into the forest like a ghost. A surge of fear shot through her. She wasn't alone out here. Someone, or something, was stalking her. Without a second thought, Eva broke into a run, her feet slipping in the mud as she raced down the narrow trail. Her flashlight bobbed erratically in her hand, casting wild beams of light in every direction. She didn't dare look back. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears and the steady thump of footsteps chasing her through the woods. She had to find her way out. The edge of the forest couldn't be far. She had entered from the north, not more than half a mile from the town. But with the twisting paths and the ever-encroaching darkness, it felt like she was running in circles. The footsteps behind her grew louder, more frantic. Whoever, or whatever, was pursuing her was gaining ground. She could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze on the back of her neck. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Eva let out a gasp as she tumbled forward, falling into a shallow ravine hidden by the undergrowth. Her flashlight slipped from her grip, rolling out of reach as she hit the muddy ground hard. Pain shot through her leg as she struggled to right herself. She had twisted her ankle in the fall, and a sharp jolt of pain radiated up her leg with every movement. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand. She couldn't afford to stay down, not with her pursuers so close. In the distance, she saw the faint beam of her flashlight, flickering weakly where it had come to rest against a fallen log. The shadows pressed in around her, and for a moment she considered abandoning the light and running for her life. But then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. The sound reverberated through the trees, deep and menacing, and it sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. Eva's breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the source of the noise. Emerging from the darkness were several figures, their shapes indistinct in the rain and shadows. They moved with a strange, unnatural grace, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The Watchers. Eva had heard stories of them, creatures that were said to guard the secrets of the Whispering Woods. They were part of the town's lore, ancient beings that protected whatever lay buried beneath the forest floor. Most people dismissed them as myths, but as the figures crept closer, their glowing eyes locked on her, Eva realized the stories had been all too real. They weren't human, but they weren't animals either. Their forms shifted in the darkness, their outlines flickering as if they were only partially tethered to this world. The growling intensified, a warning that Eva had trespassed too far. She limped toward her flashlight, her fingers trembling as she snatched it from the ground. She flicked it on, aiming the beam directly at the advancing figures. But the light seemed to have little effect. They didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, they continued to close the distance, their glowing eyes never leaving her. Panic surged through her as she backed away, her injured leg throbbing with each step. The notebook was still clutched tightly in her hand, and she realized with growing dread that this was what they wanted. Jacob Dwyer had discovered their secret, and now she had too. She had to get out of these woods. If she didn't, she wouldn't just disappear like Jacob. She would become another story, another warning whispered by the townspeople around their fires. Just as the Watchers seemed to close in on her, a deafening crack echoed through the forest, followed by a blinding flash of light. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the figures stopped in their tracks, their glowing eyes flickering. Eva seized the moment, bolting through the trees with everything she had left. She didn't know where the sudden explosion of light had come from, but it didn't matter. It had bought her precious seconds and she wasn't going to waste them. She limped as fast as she could, the pain in her leg forgotten as adrenaline surged through her veins. She could see the edge of the forest now, the faint glow of street lights just beyond the trees. Freedom was within reach. But as she neared the town's border, a familiar voice echoed in her mind, Jacob's final message from the notebook. Find it before it finds you. Eva knew she was far from safe. The Watchers had let her go, but they weren't finished with her. Not yet. Whatever secret lay hidden in these woods, it wasn't going to stay buried much longer. And the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Eva didn't stop running until she was clear of the woods and standing under the pale glow of the streetlights that lined the outskirts of Havenbrook. The town's buildings stood silent and still, the rain having subsided into a fine mist that clung to the air. Her heart was still pounding and her ankle throbbed with every step, but she couldn't let herself rest. Not yet. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the watchers peering at her from the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, only the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. The watchers hadn't followed her out of the woods, and for that she was grateful. But that didn't mean she was safe. With Jacob's notebook still clutched tightly in her hand, Eva limped toward her apartment, every nerve in her body on edge. She had uncovered something dangerous, something the town had buried deep within the woods. And now she was entangled in it. Back inside her apartment, Eva locked the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. The small space felt stifling, cluttered with the remnants of her investigation. Newspaper clippings, old photographs, and her scattered notes. But it was home, and for the first time in hours she felt a modicum of safety. She sank into the chair by the dining table and opened Jacob Dwyer's notebook again. The pages were worn and creased, the ink smudged in places, but she forced herself to focus. There had to be more clues hidden within his frantic scribblings, something that could help her make sense of the watchers, the whispers, and the cabin. Flipping through the pages, her eyes landed on an entry that seemed different from the others. It wasn't as frantic, the handwriting more controlled. The date at the top caught her attention. One day before Jacob disappeared. I finally found it. The key to everything that's been haunting me for months. It's in the archives, hidden in plain sight. The truth is buried beneath layers of lies, and they've been watching me ever since I uncovered it. I don't have much time. I need to retrieve it before they stop me. The archives. Eva's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what Jacob was referring to. The town's historical archives, located in the basement of the old library. If Jacob had found something there, something that tied everything together, it could be the break she needed. But if the watchers had been following Jacob, they would likely be keeping an eye on anyone who ventured too close to the truth. Still, Eva had no choice. She couldn't just walk away now, not when she was so close. With renewed determination, she grabbed her coat and shoved the notebook into her bag. The pain in her ankle had dulled to a manageable ache, and she knew she couldn't waste any time. She had to go to the library before anyone, or anything, could stop her. As she stepped back out into the misty night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes scanned the empty streets, searching for any sign of movement. But Havenbrook was eerily quiet, its residents tucked away in their homes, blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurked just beyond the town's borders. Eva's thoughts were racing as she made her way to the library. Jacob had written about the truth being buried beneath layers of lies, but what truth? What was so important that it had drawn the attention of the watchers? And what had happened to him after he uncovered it? The library loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered by time. It was one of the oldest buildings in town, and its dimly lit windows gave off an unsettling aura. The place was usually empty at this hour, and Eva was grateful for that. She didn't want to have to explain herself to anyone, not yet. She hurried inside, the musty scent of old books greeting her as she entered. The library was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the overhead lights. Eva made her way to the back of the building, toward the narrow staircase that led to the basement archives. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she descended the stairs, the air growing colder the deeper she went. The basement was dimly lit, the rows of shelves packed with dusty old records and forgotten documents. Eva's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out Jacob's notebook and flipped to the entry about the archives. There were no specifics, no clear indication of what he had found, but she had to trust that he had left a clue somewhere. She began her search, sifting through old ledgers, maps, and town records. The minutes ticked by as she combed through the shelves, her frustration mounting with every passing moment. But just as she was about to give up, something caught her eye, a thin yellowed file tucked behind a stack of books. She pulled it out carefully, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the faded label on the front. Project Aegis, 1974. Her hands shook as she opened the file. Inside were a series of old documents, some typewritten, others handwritten in messy scrawls. The papers were brittle with age, but the contents were clear enough. It appeared to be a series of reports detailing an experiment conducted right here in Havenbrook nearly 50 years ago. Eva's eyes widened as she skimmed the first few pages. The experiment had been conducted by an organization called the Aegis Initiative, a secretive group that had been working under the guise of the local government. They had been experimenting on something they had found in the woods. The details were vague, but the reports mentioned anomalies, strange phenomena that had appeared in the forest. The Aegis Initiative had been studying these anomalies, trying to harness their power. But something had gone wrong. The last report mentioned containment failures and unforeseen consequences before abruptly cutting off. Eva's stomach churned as she pieced it together. The Watchers, they weren't just creatures born of myth and superstition. They were tied to the experiment, guardians of whatever the Aegis Initiative had unleashed in those woods. The anomalies, the whispers, the disappearances, it was all connected to this long-forgotten project. But the most disturbing revelation was at the bottom of the final report, a list of names. Names of people who had been involved in the project. Eva's heart nearly stopped when she saw the last name on the list, Jacob Dwyer. Eva sat back in shock. Jacob hadn't just been an innocent bystander who stumbled upon the truth, he had been part of the experiment itself. And whatever they had been working on in those woods, it had come back to haunt him. The weight of the discovery settled over her like a heavy blanket. Jacob had known all along, known what had been buried in the woods, known that the Watchers were hunting him. And now they were hunting her too. Eva gathered the file and stuffed it into her bag along with Jacob's notebook. She had to get this information out, had to expose what had happened in Havenbrook all those years ago. But as she stood to leave, she heard it again, the soft, unmistakable rustling of movement in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the entrance to the archives. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the light, was a figure. Its glowing eyes watched her, unblinking. One of the Watchers had followed her. Eva's blood ran cold. She couldn't run, not with her ankle still aching and the confined space of the basement leaving her with nowhere to go. She had to think fast, had to find a way to escape before the creature closed in on her. The Watcher stepped closer, its form shifting unnervingly in the darkness. Eva's mind raced as she backed up against the shelves, her eyes scanning the room for anything she could use to defend herself. And then she remembered Jacob's last entry in the notebook. The key to everything, it's in the archives. Eva's hand flew to the pocket of her bag, pulling out the notebook once more. She flipped to the final page, her eyes scanning the words frantically. The answer was here, hidden within these documents. And she had to find it before the Watcher found her. The air in the basement grew heavier as the Watcher crept closer, its glowing eyes fixed on Eva. She could feel the weight of its presence like a vice tightening around her chest. The room seemed to shrink with every step it took, the walls closing in as fear clawed at her from the inside. Eva's hands shook as she clutched Jacob's notebook, her mind racing. There had to be something in here, something that Jacob had left behind. A key. He had written that the key was in the archives, hidden in the very pages she now held. She frantically flipped through the last few entries, scanning for anything she might have missed. The Watcher's footsteps were unnervingly quiet, almost as if it floated just above the ground, stalking her with predatory precision. Eva's heart pounded in her ears as she reached the final page. Her eyes landed on a single line scribbled at the bottom in Jacob's cramped handwriting. The past is the key to the present. Look to where it all began. Where it all began. Eva's breath quickened as she processed the words. Jacob wasn't talking about the experiment in the woods, he was talking about something older. Something that went back further than the Aegis Initiative. She racked her brain, trying to remember everything she'd learned about Havenbrook and its history. Suddenly it clicked. The founding of the town. Havenbrook had always been shrouded in mystery. The official story was that it had been founded in the late 1800s by a group of settlers, but there were rumors, whispers that predated the town itself. Tales of an ancient, sacred land that had been disturbed when the settlers arrived. The watchers, the whispers in the woods, it all tied back to this land long before any experiment had taken place. Eva's fingers flew over the documents in the file she had found, searching for anything related to the town's early history. And then she found it, a map, worn and fragile, showing Havenbrook as it had once been. In the center of the map was a symbol, a strange, circular marking that didn't appear on any modern maps of the town. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she was looking at. The marking was in the woods, right where the old cabin stood. The origin point. The watcher took another step toward her, its eyes burning brighter in the darkness. Eva forced herself to focus. She couldn't let fear paralyze her now, not when she was so close. The map was a cipher. She could see it now, hidden within the markings, a series of symbols and lines that seemed to form a pattern. She pulled out her phone, using the dim light to trace the shapes with her fingers. The pattern wasn't random, it was a code that pointed to something buried beneath the cabin. Something that hadn't been uncovered yet. Her mind raced as she worked through the cipher. Jacob had known about this. He had been trying to decipher it before he disappeared. And now she had picked up where he left off. The watcher was only a few feet away now, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sensed her determination. Eva's hands trembled as she completed the pattern, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what it revealed. A location. A place deep within the woods not far from the cabin. A place marked with the same circular symbol from the map. It was a burial site, ancient and hidden, where the truth had been buried long ago. And it was the source of everything, the whispers, the watchers, the anomalies. Jacob had been right. The truth was buried here, and now she knew where to find it. Eva looked up, her heart pounding as the watcher loomed over her. Its form seemed to shift and blur in the dim light, its glowing eyes flickering with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had the key and she knew where to go. The watcher could sense it too. It hesitated, its eyes flicking toward the notebook in her hand as if recognizing the weight of the knowledge she now possessed. Eva took a step forward, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering at the edges of her mind. "I know what you're guarding," she said, her words firm. "And I'm going to uncover it." The watcher remained motionless for a moment, its eyes locking onto hers. For a brief, tense second, the room seemed to hum with energy, as if the very air had come alive with anticipation. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the watcher receded into the shadows, its glowing eyes fading into the darkness. The weight in the room lifted, and Eva could breathe again. She didn't know why the watcher had retreated, but she wasn't going to question it. She had what she needed. Gathering her belongings, she carefully folded the map and tucked it into her bag. There was no turning back now. The truth was within her grasp, and she was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. As Eva ascended the stairs and left the library, her mind was already racing ahead. The burial site was her next destination, but she knew she couldn't go alone. She needed help, someone who could watch her back while she ventured into the unknown. And she knew exactly who to call. When she reached her apartment, Eva pulled out her phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Eva? It's late. What's going on?" It was Tom, her friend and the town's local historian. He had always been the skeptical type, dismissing most of the town's legends as superstition. But if anyone could help her piece together the truth, it was him. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "There's something I found in the archives. Something big. Meet me at the old cabin in the woods tomorrow morning. And bring everything you have on Havenbrook's founding." Tom was silent for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "Eva, you're not seriously dragging me into one of your conspiracy theories again, are you?" "This isn't just a theory, Tom," she replied, glancing at the notebook and map in her hands. "This is real. And I can prove it." There was another pause on the line, and then Tom's voice softened. "Okay, fine. I'll be there. But you better not get me killed out there." Eva allowed herself a small smile. I'll see you in the morning. As she hung up, she felt a surge of anticipation. The pieces were coming together. The truth was buried in the woods, waiting to be uncovered. And tomorrow she and Tom would uncover it together. But as Eva lay down to rest, the whispers returned, soft and insistent at the edges of her consciousness. The woods weren't done with her yet, and neither were the watchers. The sun barely crested the horizon as Eva made her way toward the edge of the woods. The early morning mist clung to the ground, swirling around her ankles as she walked, creating an eerie atmosphere that only heightened her nerves. Her heart raced with anticipation, but her mind was focused. She had a plan. Today they would uncover the truth that had been buried for decades. Tom was already waiting at the agreed-upon spot, a small clearing just before the woods thickened into the dark, twisting trees that led to the cabin. He was leaning against his car, arms crossed, looking skeptical but concerned. His shaggy brown hair was tousled, and his glasses perched low on his nose. As soon as he saw Eva, he pushed himself off the car and approached her. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked, his voice low but sharp with apprehension. "I mean the cabin? The stories about the watchers? This feels like we're walking into something we don't understand." "I know what I saw, Tom," Eva said, her tone firm but understanding of his doubts. "There's something buried out there, something connected to the Aegis Initiative, the Watchers, and even the founding of Havenbrook. We need to see it for ourselves." "I can't do this alone." Tom sighed and adjusted the strap of his backpack, which bulged with old books and files on Havenbrook's history. "Fine. But you owe me a beer after this, assuming we don't get ourselves eaten by whatever's lurking in those woods." Eva smiled weakly. "Deal." Together they ventured into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The path toward the cabin was familiar to Eva now, but it felt different today, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were aware of what she intended to uncover. As they walked deeper, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind rustling the leaves, but soon growing more distinct. Words that Eva couldn't fully grasp floated through the air, just out of reach. She glanced at Tom, who seemed oblivious to the sounds, his attention focused on their surroundings. "Do you hear that?" Eva asked cautiously. Tom looked at her, frowning. "Hear what?" "The whispers," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper herself. They started again. Tom shook his head, visibly confused. "I don't hear anything, Eva. Are you sure you're not?" "I'm not imagining it, Tom," she interrupted, her voice more insistent. "This has been happening since I found the cabin. It's like the forest is alive watching us. The watchers, they're always nearby." Tom gave her a worried look but didn't say anything more. He had always been the logical one, dismissing anything he couldn't explain. But Eva could tell that even he was unnerved by the atmosphere in the woods. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cabin. It stood just as Eva had left it, weathered and decaying, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. Eva pulled out the map she had found in the archives and unfolded it carefully. The cipher she had deciphered the night before showed a location not far from here, deep within the forest. A burial site that predated Havenbrook itself. The place where everything had started. "This is it," she said, pointing to a spot on the map. "The burial site. It's about half a mile northeast of here." Tom leaned in to study the map, his brow furrowing. "You think this is where the anomalies come from? Where the watchers originated?" Eva nodded. "That's what the documents suggest. If we can find this site, we might be able to stop whatever's been happening here." Tom sighed again, but there was a hint of resignation in his expression. "Lead the way." They ventured deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser around them. The light from the rising sun barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting the forest in an ominous twilight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Eva could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her. And then, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the site. It was a small clearing hidden deep within the forest. At its center stood a circular stone structure, partially buried in the earth and overgrown with moss. The stones were ancient, their surfaces weathered by time, but the markings on them were still visible, symbols that matched the ones on the map. Eva and Tom approached cautiously, their breaths shallow as they took in the sight before them. The air here felt different, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of Eva's neck stand on end. "This is it," Eva whispered. "This is where it all began." Tom knelt beside one of the stones, tracing the symbols with his fingers. "These markings, they're not from any language I've ever seen," he murmured. "They look almost ritualistic." Eva's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the stone circle. She could feel it, whatever had been buried here, whatever the Aegis Initiative had tried to contain, it was still here, waiting. She took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the circle. The moment her foot touched the ground within the circle, the whispers intensified. They grew louder, more distinct, swirling around her like a storm of voices. Eva squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they were relentless. Suddenly, a sharp, cold pain shot through her ankle, the same ankle she had injured the night before. She stumbled, nearly falling to the ground as the pain spread up her leg, icy and unnatural. Tom rushed to her side, his voice filled with concern. "Eva, what's wrong?" Eva gasped, clutching her ankle. The pain was unbearable, as if something was pulling at her, dragging her deeper into the earth. She could feel the presence of the Watchers now, closer than ever. They were all around her, just beyond the veil of reality, waiting to strike. "We have to get out of here," Tom said urgently, pulling her back toward the edge of the circle. But Eva couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, the cold spreading through her body, paralyzing her. The whispers were inside her head now, filling her mind with fragments of forgotten memories, flashes of ancient rituals and dark, unspeakable horrors. "Eva!" Tom shouted, shaking her. "We need to leave now." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The stones in the circle vibrated, their markings glowing with an eerie, pale light. The air hummed with energy, and the forest seemed to come alive around them. Eva gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the world tilted around her. The Watchers, they were coming. She could feel them drawing closer, their presence pressing in on her from all sides. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the trembling stopped. The light from the stones faded, and the whispers receded into the distance. The air grew still again, and Eva felt the icy grip on her body loosen. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the pain in her ankle slowly subsided. Tom knelt beside her, his face pale with fear and confusion. "Eva, what the hell just happened?" he asked, his voice shaking. Eva looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "I don't know," she whispered. "But whatever we just woke up, it's not over." As they sat there in the eerie silence of the forest, Eva knew that the burial site was only the beginning. The truth they sought was far darker and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And now there was no turning back. The eerie silence clung to the air as Eva and Tom struggled to compose themselves. The cold that had gripped Eva's body was gone, but the lingering dread remained. Tom helped her to her feet, his gaze darting nervously toward the stone circle. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Whatever we just disturbed, I don't think we're safe." Eva nodded, her heart still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something ancient, something malevolent. She glanced back at the circle of stones, now dark and still, but the memory of their glow was seared into her mind. They quickly made their way back through the dense forest, the path seeming more twisted and confusing than before. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves sent a spike of adrenaline through Eva's body. The whispers had quieted, but she knew better than to believe they were truly gone. As they reached the edge of the woods, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The sight of the open clearing should have brought some relief, but instead, It only made the tension in Eva's chest tighten. The light felt wrong, artificial, almost like the forest was trying to deceive them. Tom, did the forest seem different to you this time? Eva asked, her voice hesitant as they approached his car. Tom glanced at her, his brow furrowing. Different how? I don't know, like it was shifting. The path didn't feel the same. And there was that tremor, she said, her voice trailing off. Tom paused and looked back toward the woods, his face pale. Maybe we've been out here too long. Let's just get back to town and figure out what we're dealing with. They got into Tom's car, the engine sputtering to life with a sense of urgency. As they drove away from the forest, Eva stared out the window, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened back there, whatever they had awakened, it was far from over. And it was getting closer. Back at Eva's apartment, the atmosphere felt just as tense as the forest had been. They spread out the maps and notes on the small dining table, trying to make sense of what they had found. Eva's ankle still throbbed faintly, but she pushed the discomfort aside. This stone circle, it wasn't just a burial site, Tom said as he thumbed through one of the old books he'd brought with him. These symbols, they match something I've seen before. Eva leaned forward, her interest piqued. Where? Tom flipped through the pages of an ancient tome, finally stopping on a section filled with illustrations. Here, he said, pointing to a detailed drawing of a similar stone structure. These circles weren't just graves. They were used for rituals, ancient rites meant to bind something. To contain it. To contain what? Eva asked, dread creeping into her voice. Tom shook his head. That's the thing. There's nothing concrete in any of the historical texts. But from what I can gather, these rituals were meant to keep something from escaping. And if we disturbed that circle. His voice trailed off, and Eva felt a chill run down her spine. You think we broke some kind of seal? That we released whatever was being contained? Tom's eyes met hers, and there was no trace of skepticism left in them. I don't know. But after what happened out there, I'm starting to think these old legends about the Watchers, they're not just stories. Eva leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The ritual circle, the glowing symbols, the whispers in the woods, it all pointed to something far more ancient and dangerous than she had anticipated. Whatever the Aegis Initiative had been trying to uncover, it wasn't just some scientific anomaly. It was something far worse. That night Eva couldn't sleep. The images of the glowing stones and the strange tremors in the forest haunted her thoughts. She tossed and turned, her mind unable to settle, until finally, exhaustion overtook her and she drifted into a restless sleep. But her dreams were no refuge. In the dream, Eva found herself back in the woods, standing in the center of the stone circle. The air was thick with mist, and the whispers were louder than ever, swirling around her like a cacophony of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and she could feel the presence of the Watchers, just beyond the edge of her vision, their glowing eyes watching her from the shadows. Suddenly the ground cracked open beneath her, and Eva fell into darkness. She tumbled through an endless void, the whispers growing louder and louder until they became a deafening roar. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was only the darkness and the voices pulling her deeper and deeper. And then just as suddenly she was standing in a vast, empty space. The air was cold and still, and the ground beneath her was made of smooth, black stone. In the distance she could see a figure, a shadowy shape moving slowly toward her. As the figure drew closer, Eva's breath caught in her throat. It was Jacob. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and filled with a deep, unsettling darkness. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "Eva," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roaring silence. "You have to stop it, before it's too late." "Jacob," Eva called out, her voice echoing in the emptiness. "What do you mean? Stop what?" But Jacob didn't answer. His figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows around him. Eva reached out, trying to grab hold of him, but her hand passed through his form like mist. And then the ground beneath her gave way again, and Eva was falling once more, falling into the endless dark. Eva jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. Her skin was damp with sweat, and her breathing was ragged. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that it took her several moments to realize she was back in her apartment. She glanced at the clock. It was just past 3 a.m. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside her window. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive, and the familiar feeling of being watched crept over her. She sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the room. For a moment, everything seemed still and quiet. But then she saw it, just at the edge of her vision. A figure standing in the shadows near the window. Its form was dark and indistinct, but its eyes glowed faintly with that eerie, unnatural light. Eva's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move toward her, its eyes fixed on hers. She could feel the cold creeping back into her limbs, the same icy grip she had felt in the forest. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, growing louder as the figure drew closer. She scrambled out of bed, her heart racing as she backed away from the approaching shadow. The figure didn't stop, it continued to advance, its glowing eyes locking onto hers with a predatory intensity. Eva reached for the nearest object, a lamp on the bedside table, and swung it toward the figure. But her hand passed through it as if it wasn't even there, and the lamp crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The figure stopped, its glowing eyes narrowing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, fading into the shadows like smoke. Eva stood frozen in place, her chest heaving with fear. The room was silent again, but the oppressive feeling remained. She knew the watchers were still there, watching her, waiting. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the danger was far from over. The next day, Eva and Tom met at the town library. The dream still haunted her, but she pushed it to the back of her mind as they combed through the archives, searching for anything that could give them answers. As they worked, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whatever had been buried in the woods, whatever the watchers were guarding, it was awake now, and it was coming for them. The library was eerily quiet as Eva and Tom sifted through the dusty archives, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the occasional cough. The oppressive feeling from the night before lingered, casting a shadow over their search. Tom was engrossed in a collection of old newspapers, while Eva focused on the historical records. They were both driven by a sense of urgency, their goal to find anything that could help them understand the true nature of the Watchers and the ritual circle. Eva glanced at the old map she had found. The symbols and patterns seemed to hold the key, but the meaning behind them remained elusive. She had hoped that researching the town's early history would reveal something concrete, but so far, nothing had shed light on their current predicament. Anything useful? Eva asked, looking up from her papers. Tom looked up from a stack of yellowing newspapers, his face etched with frustration. Not much. Most of these articles are about mundane town events. But there is one thing that keeps coming up in these old stories: references to disappearances and strange occurrences around the founding of the town. Eva's interest peaked. Disappearances? Strange occurrences? Tell me more. Tom handed her a newspaper article dated from the late 1800s. It described several unexplained disappearances in the years leading up to the town's official founding. The accounts were vague but unsettling, hinting at a series of strange events that had occurred before Havenbrook was established. These articles mention people going missing and odd happenings in the woods, Tom said, his voice low. But they're all written in a way that makes them sound like local legends rather than documented facts. Eva scanned the article, her mind racing. Could these disappearances be connected to the Watchers? Maybe they were trying to keep the knowledge of the ritual circle buried. Tom nodded. It's possible. If the Watchers are as ancient as we think, they might have been trying to protect something, or prevent people from finding out the truth. Eva's eyes were drawn to a particular sentence in the article. The old ones speak of shadows in the forest, watching from beyond the veil. It echoed the whispers she had heard in the woods in her apartment. "Tom," Eva said, her voice urgent. "We need to look into these old stories more deeply. There might be a connection between the Watchers, the ritual circle, and these early disappearances." Tom nodded, clearly as disturbed as Eva. "Let's see if we can find more records. Maybe there's something in the town's archives or historical society that can give us a clearer picture." They continued their search, diving deeper into the old records. As the hours passed, Eva couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she half expected to see those glowing eyes in the shadows. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to follow them, thickening with each passing minute. Eventually, they stumbled upon a ledger detailing the construction of the town's early buildings. Among the entries was a note about the clearing of a section of forest for the town's establishment. The entry was accompanied by a rough sketch of the area, showing the stone circle they had discovered, labeled as an ancient monument. Eva's pulse quickened. "This sketch, it's almost identical to the one in the map. It confirms that the stone circle was there before the town was founded." Tom peered over her shoulder. So the circle was part of the land before the settlers arrived. It makes sense that they would have seen it as a significant site. "Or dangerous," Eva added. "It could be why there were so many disappearances. Maybe people were drawn to it and never came back." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible. And if the Watchers were guarding the site, they might have been trying to keep people away from something even darker." The idea sent a shiver down Eva's spine. If the Watchers were guarding something, it meant that whatever was buried in that clearing was far more dangerous than they had imagined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the library, Eva and Tom decided to take a break. They stepped outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the stuffy interior. The sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink, but the beauty of the sunset did little to calm Eva's unease. "We need to go back to the clearing," Eva said, her voice resolute. "There's something we missed, something important. But we need to be careful. Whatever we disturbed might not be done with us yet." Tom looked at her, his expression serious. "I agree. But we need to prepare ourselves. If we're dealing with something this powerful, we need to know what we're up against." They spent the evening gathering supplies, flashlights, protective gear, and any additional research they could find. Eva's mind was already on the clearing, on the Watchers, and on the truth they were so close to uncovering. As they prepared for the next day, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The Watchers were growing bolder, more persistent, and their presence was becoming harder to ignore. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and Eva knew that they needed to act quickly before it was too late. The forest was still and silent as Eva and Tom made their way back to the clearing. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the last vestiges of daylight were fading fast. The trees, cloaked in shadow, seemed to close in around them, amplifying the tension that had been building since their last visit. Eva's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the clearing. The forest, which had felt oppressive and menacing the previous day, now seemed to hum with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. The shadows seemed deeper, and the whispers, though faint, still lingered in the back of her mind. Tom glanced at her, his face illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. "Are you sure we should be doing this tonight? It's already dark." Eva nodded, her expression grim. "We need to see what's changed. If there's something dangerous out here, we need to understand it before it's too late." They reached the clearing and paused at the edge, taking a moment to survey the scene. The stone circle stood eerily still, its ancient markings now bathed in the cold, silver light of the moon. The oppressive feeling that had plagued them seemed even stronger here, and Eva could feel the weight of the Watcher's presence more than ever. "Stay close and keep your eyes open," Eva said, her voice low. "We don't know what we might find." Tom nodded, his flashlight sweeping over the clearing as they cautiously approached the stone circle. The ground felt different beneath their feet, colder and more unsettling, as if the very earth was reacting to their presence. Eva carefully inspected the stone circle, noting any changes from their previous visit. The stones themselves looked the same, but the markings seemed to have a faint, almost imperceptible glow, a subtle shift that made her skin crawl. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to one of the stones. "The symbols, they seem to be shifting." Eva leaned in, her flashlight illuminating the symbols. They were indeed moving, the lines and shapes rearranging themselves in a pattern that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The change was so subtle it was almost imperceptible, but Eva could feel the malevolent force behind it. "This isn't good," Eva said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's like the stones are responding to us. Whatever was contained here is trying to break free." Tom swallowed hard. "We need to find out what these symbols mean. Maybe they'll give us a clue about how to stop this." They began to examine the symbols more closely, taking photos and making notes. As they worked, the temperature in the clearing dropped, and the shadows seemed to deepen. The whispers, faint at first, grew louder, filling the clearing with a disembodied, eerie murmur. Eva felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced around the clearing. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and she could almost make out dark shapes moving at the edge of her vision. "Tom, do you see that?" Eva whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom looked up, his flashlight scanning the shadows. "See what?" "Those shapes, they're moving," Eva said, her voice strained. "I think we're not alone." As if on cue, a low growl reverberated through the clearing. The sound was deep and resonant, emanating from the shadows just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Eva and Tom froze, their breaths catching in their throats. The growl grew louder, more intense, and the shadows began to coalesce into darker, more defined forms. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing with a pale, malevolent light. The watchers were no longer hiding, they were coming for them. Eva grabbed Tom's arm, her grip tight. "We need to leave. Now." Tom nodded, his face pale with fear. They turned and began to retreat, but the shadows seemed to follow them, closing in from all sides. The growling grew louder, a relentless sound that echoed through the trees. As they stumbled through the forest, the oppressive presence of the watchers pressed in on them. The darkness seemed to close around them, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Eva and Tom pushed through the underbrush, their flashlights cutting through the dense, shifting shadows. The path that had seemed familiar before now appeared twisted and foreign, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep them from escaping. They finally emerged from the woods, gasping for breath, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. The cool night air was a welcome relief, but the feeling of being pursued remained. "What was that?" Tom asked, his voice shaky. "What did we just encounter?" Eva shook her head, her thoughts racing. "I don't know, but it's clear that whatever is in those woods is more powerful than we imagined. The Watchers are real, and they're not going to let us interfere with their secrets." Tom looked at her, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "We need to figure out how to stop this. If the Watchers are guarding something, there must be a way to contain it, something we can use to protect ourselves and the town." Eva nodded, her mind already working through their next steps. "We need to go back to the archives. There has to be more information there, something that can help us understand how to stop this." They made their way back to town, the oppressive feeling of being watched slowly fading as they left the forest behind. But Eva knew that the danger was far from over. The Watchers were still out there, and they were not going to rest until their secrets were fully uncovered. As they prepared for another night of research, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever was contained in that clearing was growing stronger, and they needed to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The early morning hours were spent in a frenzy of activity. Eva and Tom returned to the town library, driven by a sense of urgency. The disturbing events of the previous night had left them both shaken, but they knew they had to press on if they were to prevent whatever ancient evil was awakening from being unleashed upon the world. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the quiet town, Eva and Tom huddled over the stacks of books and papers they had amassed. The room was filled with the soft glow of desk lamps and the rustling of pages. The weight of their task hung heavily over them, but they focused intently on their research. Eva had pulled out several old town records and historical documents, while Tom continued to pore over the ancient texts they had found. The sense of urgency and exhaustion drove them forward, their only break coming from a brief, tense silence as they took turns making coffee. "Okay, look at this," Tom said, his voice breaking the silence. He had found a small leather-bound journal among the older documents. This journal belonged to one of the town's founders. It's filled with notes and sketches about the land and the stone circle. Eva took the journal from Tom, her hands shaking slightly as she flipped through the pages. The sketches and notes detailed the stone circle and the surrounding forest, and there were references to strange occurrences and unsettling phenomena. These entries, they describe rituals and warnings, Eva said, her eyes widening as she read. The founder was clearly aware of something powerful and dangerous in the woods. There's mention of a seal that was placed to keep whatever was contained from breaking free. Tom leaned in, studying the journal over her shoulder. The seal. That's what we disturbed. It must have been holding whatever was in those woods. Eva nodded, her mind racing. We need to find out how to restore the seal, or at least contain whatever we've unleashed. If the Watchers are involved, they might have been the ones keeping it contained. In the journal, Eva found detailed instructions for performing a ritual to strengthen the seal. The steps were complex and required specific materials, some of which they had never seen before. But there was also a clear warning. The ritual was dangerous and required precise execution to be effective. Tom's face was pale as he read through the instructions. This looks like it might be our only chance to stop whatever is coming. But we need to gather these materials and perform the ritual in the clearing. Eva agreed, her mind already calculating the logistics. We don't have much time. We'll need to gather everything quickly and head back to the clearing before it gets dark. They spent the rest of the day procuring the necessary materials: herbs, ritual tools, and protective charms. Each item was carefully selected based on the instructions from the journal. The urgency of their task made the day seem to fly by, and by late afternoon, they were ready to head back to the clearing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Eva and Tom made their way to the forest. The clearing loomed ahead, and the oppressive feeling of being watched seemed to intensify as they approached. The shadows danced around them, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They set up their equipment at the edge of the stone circle, the moonlight casting a cold, silver glow over the clearing. Eva and Tom worked quickly and methodically, following the instructions from the journal. The ritual required precise movements and careful placement of the materials, and every step was crucial. As they worked, the shadows around them seemed to writhe and shift, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The Watchers were growing restless, their presence more palpable than ever. Eva could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around her heart, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Tom performed the final steps of the ritual, his hands steady despite the overwhelming tension. Eva held her breath as he completed the incantation, the words echoing through the clearing. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and the ground beneath them trembled slightly. As the ritual came to a close, there was a sudden, intense burst of light from the center of the stone circle. The light was blinding, and Eva had to shield her eyes. When the light finally faded, the clearing was eerily calm. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the shadows seemed to recede. Eva and Tom stood in silence, their breaths coming in heavy gasps. The stone circle looked the same as it had before, but there was a sense of tranquility that had not been there earlier. The whispers had stopped, and the feeling of being watched was gone. "Did it work?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. Eva nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. "I think so." The journal mentioned that the seal would be strengthened, and the presence of the Watchers would diminish if the ritual was successful. They packed up their equipment and made their way back to town, the night now quiet and still. The oppressive feeling that had weighed on them for so long seemed to have lifted, and the forest felt less menacing. As they reached the safety of the town, Eva felt a deep sense of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the knowledge of what they had faced, and what might still lie buried in the forest, remained with her. The town of Havenbrook would continue to thrive, oblivious to the ancient threats lurking in the shadows. Eva and Tom had confronted the darkness and survived, but the secrets of the Watchers and the stone circle would always be a part of their lives. Eva looked at Tom, her expression resolute. "We did what we could. But we need to remember that there are still things out there we don't understand. And we need to be ready if they ever come back." Tom nodded in agreement. "We will be." As they parted ways, Eva couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The Watchers had been contained, but the world was full of mysteries and dangers still waiting to be uncovered. And as she walked through the quiet streets of Havenbrook, she knew that her journey was far from over. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Dive into our playlist of supernatural thrillers for more chilling adventures. See you in the next story.